Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Australia's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I'll be your host for today's show. We're here filming at the Governance Institute of Australia's National Conference. It's a collection of company secretaries and directors who gather together to try and get their arms around changes in governance and what's happening in the boardroom. And today we're going to be dealing with the topic of how boards can understand and influence company culture. And joining me to be a part of this discussion, I'm happy to welcome Susan Forrester, who's the Director and Chair of the Remuneration Committee for G8 Education, the Chair and Non-Executive Director of the National Veterinary Care Limited, Director and Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee with Over the Wire Limited, and Director and Chair of the People and Culture Committee at Xenith IP.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
Just that introduction alone qualifies you for being here and joining. So happy to have you. So I don't have to tell you, but just to set the foundation, the issue of culture, and particularly, and I'm not sure I should use that word because everywhere I go these days it's an issue, but because of the banking issues in Australia, it has become a very focused topic.
Absolutely.
And so with your experience on the boards you have and the chair positions that you've held, my first question for you is, what can the chairperson do to, first of all, establish the right culture on the board? Because I don't think you can set the tone at the top without first dealing with the board itself.
Absolutely, and that's right. Thanks for having me, TK. I think with the increased scrutiny that we've had at board level around corporate misconduct means that directors and especially chairs really need to have their antenna on in relation to culture. So 20 years ago, boards didn't talk about culture. It was something that just came through the HR report. As a result of the Financial Services Royal Commission that we've just had the final report from, Australian boards and chairs are very much aware of getting corporate culture on the agenda. So how does a board chair do that? They get it on the agenda by really establishing a dialogue around, well, what is the culture around our board table? Is it appropriate for our vision and our purpose and our values? And if not, what might we do about it? And if the board's not comfortable and proactive talking about its own culture, then how can it then govern and oversee the culture throughout the organisation? So that's how I would sum it up: getting it on the agenda, encouraging those conversations. And the sorts of conversations I recommend that the board would be having is, what are our behaviours like around the board table? Can we see evidence of trust and respect and candour around the board table? And if not, why not?
Yeah.
And what are we doing about that? Because if there's not trust at the board level, then it's very difficult for it to make decisions that it should be making.
So as a chairman, would you do that verbally? Would you have face-to-face with that? And is there, or might you make that part of a sort of a board evaluation so that there's some ability to have anonymous comments, which sometimes people might be shy of giving in a face-to-face?
And that's a really good question. How do you approach it? Because as you can imagine, boards' size and composition range enormously across Australia. So what a not-for-profit board might be doing about its culture would be very different to what a financial services board would be doing about its culture. So you're quite right. Getting it on the agenda and having those conversations is really important. I think jumping straight to an independent assessment of corporate culture or a boardroom culture could be a bit too quick too soon, so getting directors used to talking about culture. But certainly the final report from the Royal Commission does encourage an independent assessment, because you are more likely to get frank feedback from your directors than you are just by having a fireside chat. Although I would encourage that boards endeavour to get along the maturity line in terms of their ability to have a conversation about what does culture mean, how do we assess it, how do we monitor it, and what might we do about it.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the value of board leadership. So obviously there are leaders that are excellent at engaging, their fellow directors and making them feel far more comfortable and constructive about the process.
Yes.
That is a skill set.
Absolutely.
But it's those that can, I think, can get to this probably a little faster, as you said, than those that need to take a step or two to make sure this collegial atmosphere stays that way.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Now, there's no doubt that the chair, as the leader of the board, needs to be the one as the culture champion. But I think if you're taking baby steps in terms of those conversations, you would certainly engage the chair of your Remuneration and Nominations Committee, who should be quite comfortable with measuring what we used to call the softer skills and the softer areas. Similarly, though, culture isn't all about just the general behaviours. You also have risk culture. You also have accountability culture. So you should be, if you are looking for culture champions around your board table, you'd be also looking to engage the chair of your Audit and Risk Committee as well, and saying, well, how do we keep management accountable? What sorts of conversations do we have with management to have that debate and keep them accountable, but in a respectful way?
Yeah. So we both know that once you deal with the board issue, that the company culture is something totally different.
Yes.
Certainly the CEO plays an enormous role in setting the tone for what happens within the organization. And sometimes there are things that the board can do. So let me flip that to you and say, so making sure that the right culture is within the organization, the company's culture, what sort of is the role of the board in that process?
Sure. I think the board needs to keep within its remit, and whilst they need to be champions of culture, they don't then need to sort of do it as a day job within the corporation. So when you think about what the role of the board is, one of their key roles is to appoint and monitor the performance of a CEO. So the board needs to make sure that that CEO is appointed and they have aligned values and they have aligned vision with the corporate culture. And as we've said, you can't prescribe culture, so it's not as if you can give the CEO a checklist and say, here's the corporate culture we need you to apply across the organisation. But I think in recruiting a CEO, you can ensure that they have aligned visions and aligned behaviours. That'd be the first thing I'd do. The second key role of the board, TK, is obviously around setting strategy, and the board needs to make sure that in setting that strategy, they are taking the corporate culture into account and saying, if we go down a strategy that focuses on, let's say, profit over people, then how does that align with our culture that actually says that we value our people? Yeah. So aligning strategy and culture and behaviours is important as well. And I think if the board focuses on those things, the other will follow if the CEO is then doing their job in terms of imbuing that culture through the organisation.
Yeah. I've always believed over the years that there's, again, some subtle things that the boards can do, but that because they're not around
correct
that often, they don't have near the opportunity to influence as, say, the management team does. But at the same time, there are what I like to call watershed moments. And I'll give you an example. So there's a salesperson in China who ends up having great performance for his division. Well, it's commonly known among the organization that he or she cut a lot of corners and didn't follow the rules, put the company at risk for the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And if it's common knowledge, there's an opportunity where the board can send a very serious message that even though this person is a good person, they didn't operate, they put the company at risk for a large fine, and we're not going to reward behavior that isn't within the confines. And watershed moments like that the board has, I sometimes think they don't realize sometimes that what a decision will mean to their thousands of employees that are watching to see how things are going to be treated according to their conduct policy and stuff like that. So it's important, and I'm curious of your comments, it's important that the board look at each thing and say, what is the message we're sending by
That's exactly right, TK. And you know, if a board really needs to have zero tolerance around that kind of behaviour, if they have remuneration practices that say we are trying to reward the right behaviours and we will penalise the wrong behaviours. So they do need to single that out. They do need to be champions around that. And I think they can do that through all the corporate communications that are there, via through social media or through the town hall meetings, etc. It wouldn't be singling out a particular event, but it would be the messaging around, we have reviewed our remuneration practices and our remuneration frameworks, and these are the behaviours we want to reward. And we will penalise, we will have a zero tolerance for those that we don't. I think those kind of watershed moments also come up to a board when there are major proposals on the table, and the question around managing the risk around those proposals shouldn't be what can we do legally, what can we get away with legally, but more so what should we do? What's the right thing to do? And that's coming up more and more in those conversations because, as you say, it's the board's responsibility in terms of corporate culture is now being demanded from employees, from shareholders, from the community, and through, as we were saying earlier, you know, even the litigants in the community.
As I travel through the U.S. and through Europe and now through Australia, it seems like all boards are struggling with the same challenge, and that is how do we get our arms around understanding what our culture is today, you know? And so you've obviously been faced with that problem. I'm curious on how you go about understanding where you stand today with a particular company's culture.
Sure, and I think every board member in Australia is thinking about that at the moment in terms of how do we get our arms around it and understand it. So I think the starting point is the messages that have come from the final report from the Royal Commission. Even though that only applies to financial services companies, it's just as valid for all directors, and that is that corporate culture can't be prescribed and it's very hard to regulate, but it can be assessed and it can be measured. So before you rush into trying to, in order to understand corporate culture, you need to assess it. And the way I would recommend that you go about assessing it is look at all the different data points that are available. So what is your employee engagement surveys telling you? What are your customer surveys telling you? What is your community telling you? And all that information that you often get through your human resources reports, such as employee turnover, employee engagement feedback. Look for all those data points to come through to give you a set of data which will inform you about what's working, what is currently presenting as your culture, and where would you like it to go. So if you've got really, poor turnover, poor employee engagement, well, what are employees looking for, and what are they wanting from the organisation? So I think rather than a tick the box exercise, which I fear could be a reaction to the Royal Commission, which says, most financial services companies need to actually do a culture assessment, rather than rushing off with a tick-the-box type approach. You really should be taking in all the data you possibly can, and then making an assessment about, well, what have we got? What would we like it to be? And what do we need to do to improve that? And data is great, TK, but I also recommend that board directors get out and about and make sure that they attend social functions with employees, they attend, the AGM obviously, they get out and talk to customers as well, because you don't only want to have data in front of you, you need, just much more real information.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you said, I just want to reiterate too, it was great to hear that you use the remuneration committee in the sense of looking at performance reviews and what you're rewarding.
Yes.
That seems like a very important part of the process, because no matter what anybody else says, that, I remember CEOs saying we're a sales company, and then you go look at their performance review, and the way you get promoted was to have a good audit or something else. So
That's right.
the people basically ignored what was being told to them because everything else was pointing at a different direction. So those are things that the board can look at from the quote 30,000 feet.
Absolutely.
And say, is all this matching up together? So
That's correct.
Anyway, it's going to be interesting times, not just in Australia, but I think in all the markets across the globe. But Susan, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and share some thoughts on how you deal with it. And I wish you good fortune at the companies that you're serving as a board on.
Thanks so much, TK.
Yeah. And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside Australia's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again soon to take another look at a topic that'll make you a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.